Hello everybody! I hope everyone's having a wonderful day. So today we're going to be doing our next lesson, which is going to be building towards getting our first computer program written. So for this lesson you'll be needing some code editor, the ability to write the code in that editor and to run Java code. So to compile and execute. We'll be doing this all in Eclipse. In the previous lesson I showed you how to install Eclipse and the JDK respectively. So we'll have all the stuff set up for doing this. So if you're following along with this video, I recommend opening up, actually you can open up Eclipse. We'll be moving right into Eclipse after we talk a little bit more about Java and just general concepts in programming. So we'll talk about a few things, then we're going to get back into coding and we'll walk through how we can make a program, building a new project in Eclipse, a new class, and writing all that stuff up, the so-called classes. So Java is what is often called an object-oriented programming language, or OO programming language. So somebody tells you, oh, do you do OO programming? Java would be one of these programming languages for which you write some OO in. So what does this mean? There's so-called programming paradigms that different programming languages are built around. Sometimes they have multiple paradigms. But the main thing I want you to be aware of is so-called the object-oriented programming style. So in this paradigm, programming is centered around the concept of an object. So you can think of this like a model that represents something that we're trying to implement on the computer. So objects contain usually these two things. Data, so these are usually called attributes or properties. We'll see that these are usually declared as things called variables, or so-called instance variables sometimes. And then the second one are operations. So these are things such as so-called methods. We'll talk more about methods in a little bit. So this paradigm is what we're going to be following. Now, that being said, Java follows this quite closely. In particular, Java, all the code in Java you're going to write is written inside of something called a class. So you might ask, Dan, what is a class? So let's talk a little bit about that. So Dan, what is a class? So let's talk a little bit about what a class is. So classes are the blueprints of objects. So I'm going to say you can view classes like models for objects from everyday life to mathematical settings we can represent based on what they, so number one, what they are. So these would be, like I said before, data attributes. So data attributes. And what they do. So what do I mean by what they do? So I'm talking about methods, procedures, or operations, if you want to be a bit more broad. So classes have a name. So classes have a name. With most circumstances, you're going to be writing a class. You get to pick the name for your class. So for example, I can call a class, like if I wanted to model like roast chicken or something, I can call it roast chicken like this. I could call it my favorite ice cream. I could call it candy cane. I could also call it dog, for example. We're going to be adopting the convention of so-called capital letters. So the capital letter convention is very simple. So this is how we're going to name our classes. So we're going to start off with capital letter for the first word, capital letter for the second word, and so on. But notice there's no spaces at all. So this is a pretty standard way people like to name their classes. So like my favorite ice cream. Notice that each one of the letters for each successive word is a capital letter. You don't have to do it this way, but it's very helpful to do it this way. It makes it a little easier to tell that you're talking about a class versus something else. We're going to see that that's going to be the case quite often. When we write out our classes, they're going to have this skeletal structure. So suppose I had a class called my class name, like this. And I'm going to have these curly brackets or braces. So I'm going to declare the name. So if this is in my Java code, I would say public class. So this tells me I'm going to be writing a class. And if this is my name of my class called my class name. So this is just the name of my class. I've just called it my class name. Notice it follows the capital letter convention that I mentioned before. Remember, it's just a convention. It's just a rule that I'm using to make it easier to identify what a class is versus something else. Because we're going to have a bunch of different concepts in play when we start writing code. So this, for example, would be the structure of a class. And what we will do is in here, we type code inside the class. So inside of here, we're going to write our what they are, so the data attributes, and what they do. So these methods, for example, they're all going to go inside of here inside this class. So I want to do an example with you just to explain the concept of a class just all together. So here I have my very special friend here. I got Lola. Hi Lola, how you doing? Are you a good girl? Now Lola has a variety of different attributes. I know Lola, I know, you're a little baby. It's your beautiful puppy. Now Lola has a variety of attributes. For example, you might think of her age, how old she is, what her breed is, what her weight is. So these are different things that make Lola. So these are things, like I said, what they are. Now, what they do, Lola does all sorts of different things. Lola, what do you like doing? Do you like eating? Do you like sitting? You're sitting right now. Lola likes running. So in fact, Lola was just having a nap just a moment ago. And Lola also likes pooping. Now, each one of these things, so now imagine if I created a class called dog, it can model all of these attributes and different operations. But just to be clear, remember, as I said in my previous lesson, all of these operations have to be unambiguous. They have to be described exactly. Now, for the sake of the last operation and some of these things, because they're rather complicated operations if you really think about it. So anyways, what we can do is we can create a class dog. That could be one instance of this dog could be Lola. And Lola has different attributes. And she has a variety of operations, right? Just like I said. She could do eating, she can sleep, she can run, she can poop. We're not going to describe how we do that. It's a little too graphic for this lesson. But the point is that we can model all those things based on a dog. And Lola is an example of an instance of a dog. So the dog class is like a blueprint for every other dog I might want to model. We're going to talk more about classes more particularly in this sense when we eventually get to talking about classes more broadly. For now, we're just going to think about classes as this thing that encapsulates our program that we're going to execute. So, having said, I want to say thank you very much, Lola. You're very helpful for me. Yeah, you're very nice. Oh, you got kisses. Oh, so nice. Anyways, thanks for hanging out, Lola. Let's go down, okay? There you go. So, we can create instances of objects from classes. For example, Lola from the dog class. Each has attributes and data and methods. Now, just a couple of remarks before I get too ahead of myself, because I'm going to talk a little bit about methods. So, 2 tips that I want to make sure you're aware of. Just tips. So, first tip. There can be only one public class per Java file. Now, we haven't really talked about what public means. From my perspective and what yours should be at this point, think about it as it can be viewed by anyone in terms of if somebody wanted to use your code. Public. There's going to be other so-called accessibility levels that we can assign to different variables or classes, and we'll see that more later on. So just think public, you think, oh yeah, no, I want to be able to have it so other people can use my code, and it doesn't matter who it is. As long as they have access to my code, they can use it. And another thing that should also be worth noting, when I talk about this only one public class per Java file, the reason why, this is actually one of the big reasons why there actually is that .class file extension. So remember, I told you when you compile your Java program, your Java file, you create a class file. This is one you can easily make a mistake with. The file name of the Java file, must match, sorry, that was melting in the microwave, must match the name of the class. So for example, if I have a class called dog, my Java file is going to be called dog.java. So you wouldn't call it my favorite dog.java, it has to be called dog.java. That brings me to my next point. I want to talk about these methods. This part over here where I talk about methods. So there are 2 kinds of methods. So remember, these are like operations, like Lola sleeping and pooping and stuff. Now remember, I told you that you can actually have instances of a given class, which we call these objects. So there's 2 different kinds. There's so-called instance methods. We aren't going to see these for a little while, but I want to point out what they are. So they're a method that belongs to a given instance. So remember, when I say instance, I'm referring to not just dog, I'm referring to Lola the dog. So this would belong to Lola if I created Lola from the dog. Like I created a dog object and the dog was Lola. So this belongs to a given instance of a class. So the big thing I want you to be aware of is that it may use data associated with an instance of a class and other instance methods. So just be aware that there's these things called instance methods. They use data and attributes associated with an instance of a given class. So when I create an object of that class and I create it and say those attributes represent a dog, for example, and that dog happens to be Lola, there are instance variables. We haven't talked about what variables are yet, but these are going to be representing those attributes, and they're going to be associated with Lola. And Lola might have certain behaviors associated with just Lola. So these are so-called instance methods. We're not going to talk about these right now for quite some time. We're going to focus instead on so-called static methods. So in contrast, you're going to find that these are kind of like, there's going to be a nice contrast here. So a method that belongs to a class itself. And I must stress that it cannot use data associated with instances of a class and instance methods. So the way you should think about it, a static method, is that this is going to be a method associated with the class itself. For example, if I created an instance of a dog and those attributes represent Lola, you can't use Lola's attributes, which are representative of the dog class, inside of static methods associated with the dog class, because these are classes exclusively as tied to just the dog class itself, not instances of the dog class. For us at this time, if this sounds a little confusing at first, don't worry. We're not going to look so much at this yet. The main thing I want you to be aware of is that we're going to write code in methods. These kind of operations. We're going to write our computer programs. So I'm going to give you a Java file. It's going to have a class at the top, and it's going to have a program inside there within a method. This method is going to be a static method. That's all I want you to really take from this. What we're going to do next is we're going to move over to the computer, and what we're going to do is we're going to go to Eclipse, and we're going to set up a project, and then we're also going to make a class. So let me go over to the battle station here. So let me move on over here. When I first open up Eclipse, it'll ask me to assign a directory. So this is a place on your computer's file system. It's some folder here. So it's going to ask me to assign a place to put all of my code projects. So in Eclipse, all of your code gets associated with projects. So you create an Eclipse project, and in those project folders, you're going to end up having your code inside of there. I recommend personally just sticking to the default one they provide. This one's pretty easy to find. I just go to where I keep all my other files, like my music, pictures, and stuff. So I find this directory is pretty easy to use. I know where that is on my computer. If you're not sure, you can always pick another spot. I recommend just picking one workspace and sticking with it. So the workspace is just where all your project folders are going to be placed. Inside of each project folder is going to be your code and any files associated with the code for your project. So these might be pictures or other things that you might use for your code. So I'm just going to go to launch. Okay, so now I have Eclipse open. We're going to create a new Eclipse project. So I'm going to go File, New, Java Project. And we're going to call our project our first project. So notice I'm going to call it under project name. I'm going to write down what the name of the project is. And now I recommend, just for our purposes, selecting an execution environment that makes it easy as possible for you to compile your programs. Now, For me, I like to set it to 1.8 because in newer versions of Java, there's a feature called modules. We're not going to be using this feature at all in this series. However, if you go to the newest, most recent one, or you just simply go use default JRE, remember the JRE is what's going to execute your Java programs. You just have to check off a little box. I have it in the notes what you would do. But I'm going to just go to SC 1.8. That's going to do it well enough. I'm just going to go finish. We have our Eclipse project. The way you'll know that you successfully did this is you'll see on the Package Explorer side on the left side here, you'll see our first project. You'll see the JRE system library here. And you'll have a folder called source, SRC, like this. This is where all of our code's going to be. So if you actually go to your project folder, you'll locate a folder called source. You'll find all your Java files in there if you're curious where they are. What we're going to do is we're going to create a class right now. We're going to call it HelloWorld. Going to call it HelloWorld. So the way I want to make sure is that that this will specify where I'm placing the code. And I go hello world, and I can go finish. And now I have a class. So notice it has public class, and it says the name of my class, hello world. And now all my code's going to go inside here. Now, one thing that's very important for me to remark about is that we need to know how we can actually compile and run our programs. So it's really nice and easy in Eclipse. So you'll see that there's this green button here. It looks like a little Go symbol on it. It says run here if you hover your mouse over it. If you click this, it'll compile and run your program. It also is here if you go at the top, go run, and then there's run here. There's other versions here as well as run configurations, which we'll see more about later. But the main point is you can run and compile your program. So notice I don't have any code yet, so I need to put some code in here. Now that we have our class, we're going to move back to the board and we're going to talk a little bit about what we're going to do for our first program. Okay, so let's go back over that way. So anyways, we're going to create our first program. We're going to call it Hello World. So we've created the Hello World class in Eclipse. So Hello World, we're going to create Hello World. And what's Hello World going to do? Our program is going to print to the console. So the console is just a display area that would appear normally in a console-based interface, so like command prompt, but we can actually see it in Eclipse at the bottom for our results. So we're going to print to the console the message, hello world. So I want to print this message. Whatever I have here in the quotes, I want to print off hello world like that. So I want to send out a little message. Oftentimes when you learn a new programming language, programmers often create hello world programs that make sure that they understand how to structure their program. It's a very basic program. So just to make sure that you understand how you set up the program so you can compile and run it. So it's a common one to do. So when I created my Hello World class, I ended up getting a file called helloworld.java, which you'll find in your Eclipse project. Now, one thing that's worth noting, just as a remark, this is more of a coding thing, conventions. Oftentimes conventions are important because we need to know how we want to communicate our code, but at the same time we want to do it consistently so it's easy to read and understand. So there's a couple of different ways you could write down our class declaration. Declaration is a fancy word for me saying I'm defining the thing. But I don't necessarily need to tell you all the specs of it. I'm just defining it. So I'm just going to write this out twice. Public class hello world, like this. Now, as I mentioned, there's those curly braces or curly brackets or braces. Now, when I created my code in Eclipse, it formatted it so that the curly brace is on right after the D on the same line. You can write it out like this. This is one I tend to pick up on, but some people like to write things a little differently. For example, you could put the curly braces starting on the next line, for example. It's not too terribly picky. As long as these curly braces are left, then right. Open, then close. So this is open, and this is close. As long as those exist, you're okay for the most part. So you can pick maybe one of these two conventions as long as you're stuck with it. It's a good idea to pick a convention and stick with it. Now, one of the most important things you need to be aware of about in Java, and this is quite common in a lot of programming languages, is that in Java, the main method, the name of this method is called main. It's a very special reserved name. So don't call your own methods, as we're going to see. Don't call them main unless you want it to be this specific method. This is one of those special exceptions where you don't want to name your thing that thing. So the main method will execute code within it. So any code you put inside of the so-called main method will in fact execute. So you may have other code that performs other operations inside your class, but anything that's in this main method will in fact execute line by line, assuming that it does get executed, which if we don't do anything too special, it will execute. So we'll go line by line, executing what's in this so-called main method. So just be aware that if you want code that's going to execute for our program, it better be in this main method. Otherwise, you have to have something that's going to call that method. Call is a fancy way of saying invoking a method. You're going to see an example of what one of these methods looks like in a moment. As long as it's inside of this main method, you're okay, and it will actually run it. So anyways, so imagine you have your class header at the top like this. Like say you have public class hello world. What you would write for the main method is exactly as I wrote here. Public static void main string open square bracket close square bracket args close parenthesis, and then you would set up your curly braces or braces. Now, so this would all be inside. So this will be inside of your class. Now, public just simply means, like I said, just think of it like if somebody had your code, that they can use this code. There's nothing preventing them from using the code if they have access to your code. Static means it's a static method. Remember, we just talked about that. So this is a method that's associated with the class itself. Void, we haven't talked really what that means quite yet. We will eventually. And the key, and its name of this method, so this is the name of the method, is called main. And now all of our code that we want to execute goes inside of here. Now, it's worth noting that usually it's nice to write your code out so that you indent your code in using tab. Oftentimes in Eclipse or other IDEs, it will do it for you. I recommend indenting in your code and then typing on line by line. So you might ask, okay, so now we know what we're going to put our code into. So let me go over to Eclipse and type that in. Okay, so let's go back here. So I'm going to go public static void main args like so. And notice that it indents in my code like this. Now, you'll notice that if I try to run it, I recommend saving your code. You can go File, and then you can go Save, or you can go Control S. You'll notice it doesn't do anything. This console down here, this is the console I was referring to. So this doesn't do anything yet. Remember, we want to make it so our program will print hello world. So we need some way of doing that. And the way we're going to do that is so-called using the print method. So the way we use the print method is we call it from system, and we have system.out.print, and then what we're going to do is we're going to put our message inside of quotation marks like this. System.out.print will actually print to the console, and what we do is we provide a message for this method. So this method is called print. and we give it a message, and we put double quotes around the message we want to print to the console. So in this case, I'm going to make it print hello world. So notice that it's also worth noting that in Java, it's very important that on lines for instructions such as method calls or declarations that aren't such as this up here, we're talking about actual instructions for code that's going to execute like this, and not to be confused with other structures we're going to see later. I'm talking about so-called variable assignments, talking about method calls. So I'm calling a method right now because I'm invoking the print method, and I'm providing input for the print method. It takes in one parameter, and that is just our message. We put double quotes around the message we want to print. You got to include a semicolon at the end of the line. And long and behold, look, it prints to the console, hello world. So this is actually a very simple program. This is a program that will print hello world to the console. So just remember that code that we want to execute is inside of the main method. And to use or print to the console, we use the print method. So it's system.out.print. Later we'll see what else we can do with printing to the console. So just as a remark, I mentioned earlier on that if you don't have a semicolon at the end of a line, you'll notice that it won't compile because I didn't actually complete the instruction I'm providing to Java. Java is very picky about semicolons at the end of lines, and Eclipse will remind you of that. So you'll see a red squiggly line, just like if you're writing in a program that has a typo or something in it. You'll see a red X. It'll tell you syntax error. Insert semicolon to complete block statement. So this is a block. This is a statement. So I'm going to put my semicolon in. In fact, if I attempted to run this, it'll tell me, oh, there's errors. And Eclipse will attempt to try compiling it and running it, but it'll tell you exactly what I just said. So you put the semicolon in, the error goes away, and indeed I can run it, and I get hello world. So that being said, now we have our simple hello world program. So see, it's in hello world Java. We just get ourselves back over here. We've heard a little bit about what an object-oriented programming language is. We've seen how in Eclipse we can build Java projects and create classes. We talked about what a class is. In addition, we talked also about what exactly we can do to create a simple program like our hello world program that prints a message to the console, and how exactly we can print statements to the console itself. So with that, we've written our first computer program. Congratulations. So that being said, when we come back next time, we'll see some more stuff we can do with printing, strings, and more. So thank you very much, and have yourself a beautiful day. I'll see you later.